His intention in doing this was not merely political. He had better reasons to justify him. The Montagnards had set foot on the national defense and persisted in its maintenance, even by means of the tower, recognizing that they must either perish or conquer. The whole army, with the exception of a few political generals, had recognized this also and remained consistently loyal to them. The soldiers, like the Montagnards, were desirous to conquer, first of all for the sake of their country, and secondly for themselves. The generals had no wish to be degraded once more to the rank of sergeants, and the common soldiers of the old royal army, who now formed the rank and file of the new, had gained greatly by the revolution. But besides the rousing words of the proclamations, there were facts that convinced. With incredible stupidity, the politicians of the councils and the clubmen of Clichy, with the journalists who followed them, had fallen foul of the army. The skins of the heroes of Italy were remarkably thin, and the paltriest epigram made a rankling wound. They had expected triumphal crowns, said Bucco, but they were greeted with the contents of chamber pots. The meanness of the reproaches leveled against them was only equaled by the extravagance of their falsehood. At every engagement, the French Republicans were said to have been beaten, routed, and annihilated. Their enemies were heroes, although they happened to be murderers. The massacres at Verona were honorable, and their repression was a crime. Everything possible was done to exasperate the soldiers of their country and to show them that a struggle to the death in which either or both must succumb was inevitable between the defenders of the independence and sovereignty of the nation and the royalists who would very shortly come into power. That same anger, surprise, and determination were apparent both in the army of the Sambre and Musa and the army of Italy. Bonaparte perhaps helped to swell the torrent, but no general could have avoided it. The coup d'etat of Fructidor, at least in its beginning, was entirely a patriotic revolt engineered by the soldiers against the counter-revolution, which was prompted and supported by the foreigner. Bonaparte was neither the author nor the promoter of it, but he openly associated himself with the movement and assisted it with energy. He could not have acted otherwise without losing all his popularity with the soldiers and forfeiting all influence over them, besides making himself suspected in betraying his country. After his return from Italy, he sometimes seemed inclined to seek for some excuse to sever his fortune from that of his former patrons. He did not object to hear some of their actions freely criticized, but in spite of Campo Formio, he was not yet able to do without them. He was very far from maintaining in the Rue Chantereine the same state that he had enjoyed at Montbello. There were no more princes, ambassadors, and cardinals begging for peace. No more peoples awaiting at his hand constitutions guaranteeing their liberty and independence. There was no longer a court to which every official pressed, and where he was accustomed to the deepest respect. Certainly he was given a hearty welcome and accorded official distinctions, while the street in which he lived was decorated in triumph. His popularity was indeed great, and all society would crowd to see him at a ball, but this was not likely to last long in Paris. A singer's voice, the escapades of a young lady, a dirty novel, or a sensational murder made as good material for gossips as a general's victories, better even, and were less easily exhausted, except his election to the membership of the Institute in the place of Carnot, who had been outlawed in Fructidor. Bonaparte gained nothing in Paris and left with haste equal to that made by his old friends. To procure his departure, he sought for some glorious enterprise, and Egypt suggested itself, but the means were first necessary. He had need of ships, soldiers, a commissariat, and all the military equipment of which the government held the key. He asked also for scientists, painters, engineers, and poets. There was no stinting him. He chose and suggested, but the Directory decided and paid. He carried in his train of France in miniature, of France, in which every person was of value to the Commonwealth. If not the first in his department, a perfected France in which talent was as conspicuous as courage, and which, if the larger community had perished, could have reproduced all its essential qualities. Over this miniature France, He could put into practice his ideas of government more freely than he had done in Italy. Perhaps he had intended, if fortune proved favorable, to have fixed his future in the East and have realized his dream. Who can tell? It is no commonplace soul that is attracted by the destiny of Alexander. Supposing Napoleon had set out from his base in Egypt to throw an army of 60,000 men across the Indus to arouse the Marathas and conquer India. Supposing he had founded an empire stretching from the Nile to the Ganges and from the Mediterranean to the Sea of China, thus equaling at least the gigantic Persian, Macedonian, Arabian, and Mongol conquerors who had preceded him in the same ambitions, would he not then have glutted his soul with the glory for which it belonged? Or would his name have been less deeply burnt upon the pages of history, and his career have seemed to posterity less astonishing and more empty? All this passed through his mind and haunted him as far as St. John of Acre. If this place had been taken, he said, the French army would have flown to Damascus and Aleppo and have reached the Euphrates in an instant. The Druzes and the Christians of Syria and Armenia would have made common cause with us. The nations would have been staggered. Our reinforcements would have amounted to 600,000 men. I would have taken Constantinople in India and have changed the face of the world. But however much his dream appealed to him, and however near he came to realizing it, he did not sever himself from France. Whether it was that he was restrained by the necessity of sending for reinforcements and the loyalty of his troops to the Republic, for neither officers nor men were yet entirely devoted to him, and he had to deal with several cases of insubordination, not to say mutiny, among them, or that he wished to provide for himself in case of defeat or in insuperable check that means of retrieving in other estates the fortune which escaped him in Egypt. Whatever the reason might be, he still kept up a connection and alliance with the Directory and the councils through his wife and brothers, whom he had left in Paris. Josephine was often in the company of Barat, Rubel, and Goyer. Doubtless she had not much affection for her absent husband, from whom she was thinking of obtaining a divorce and whom she continually deceived, but the different connections into which she had entered were likely to prove useful to him on his return. Joseph and Lucien, fighting for their own hands, had become influential in the councils. The power of the one lay in the lobbies, of the other in the tribune. They were deeply concerned in the official and political world, where clever men were scarce, owing to the decimations of the last 6 years, from 1792 to the year 4. Of the 1,080 members and the deputies elected to the convention, 151 had disappeared, died, been executed, murdered, or committed suicide. Again, in Fructidor of the year 5, it had been skimmed of every newcomer who was offensive to the mediocrities in office. Since then, it had been recruited only with puppets favorable to the Republican bloc, who could inspire neither envy nor suspicion in this lifeless assembly, such as is always produced in a democracy when the official candidateship is utterly corrupt. The Bonapartes soon played an important part, armed as they were with the money which Napoleon had brought back from Italy and entrusted Joseph. They established themselves in a conquered country by hereditary descent and by constant exercise in the Corsican assemblies. They possessed a genius for the life of finesse and intrigue, which is always the same in any assembly. This was well seen in Germany out of the year 7, when Lucien, for his own political interests, did what he would in the councils and obliged the majority of the directors to resign or retire.